A horse stormed into the hospital, leaving everyone frozen in shock. But what happened next with the patient defied all belief. The wind howled across the vast plains of Texas, sweeping up clouds of dust and rustling the dry grass that stretched endlessly to the horizon. For Cale, it was just another day, like so many others in his 12 years. He knew the solitude of the open fields, the searing heat of the sun, and the occasional breeze that carried with it the distant promise of rain. His day had been spent guiding his family's sheep through the sparse terrain, ensuring they grazed well before it was time to herd them back home. He didn't complain, though there were moments when he wished for more than the distant bleating of the flock to keep him company. Despite that, Kyle cherished the freedom of the plains, the sense that the world stretched out infinitely before him, a playground with no walls. But today felt different. As he walked, something unusual caught his eye among the brittle bushes. Squinting against the shimmering heat, he noticed a dark shape moving weakly under the relentless sunlight. His heart quickened, and he approached cautiously, his steps deliberate, his gaze narrowing to make out the details. When he got closer, his breath hitched. "A horse," he murmured, quickening his pace. Lying in the dirt was a young foal, its coat matted with sweat and dust, its labored breathing audible even from a distance. A jagged wound on its flank bled sluggishly, staining the dry earth with streaks of red. Kyle dropped to his knees beside it, his chest tightening at the sight. The foal's condition was dire, its energy nearly spent, its body trembling from the loss of blood. Yet when its dark eyes fluttered open and met Kyle's, something about their gaze struck him deeply, a silent plea that he couldn't ignore. "I'm not leaving you here," he whispered, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Working quickly, he fashioned a makeshift sling from an old blanket he carried, careful not to worsen the animal's injuries. His father often said that animals understood more than people gave them credit for, and Kyle felt that now, sensing the foal's quiet determination to hold on, as if it recognized that help had arrived. The journey back to his family's ranch was grueling. Every step felt like a test of endurance, with the foal's fragile life hanging in the balance. But Kyle didn't falter. He pressed on, even as sweat soaked his shirt and his legs ached with effort. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. His mother's eyes widened when she saw him staggering into the yard with the foal. "Kyle, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with concern as she ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "The poor thing looks so bad, sweetheart." "I know, Mom," he replied firmly, meeting her gaze, "but I can't just let it die. I have to try." With her help, they prepared a warm corner in the barn, laying down hay and blankets to make the foal as comfortable as possible. For the next several days, Kyle dedicated himself entirely to the animal's care. He cleaned its wounds, offered small amounts of water, and draped extra blankets over it during the chilly nights. He watched it closely, counting each shallow breath, praying silently that none would be its last. Word spread quickly through the small community, and curious neighbors began stopping by to see the boy and his unlikely charge. Few believed the foal would survive. "Too weak," some said, shaking their heads. "You should put it out of its misery," others suggested. But Cale ignored them, driven by a determination he couldn't explain. He refused to give up, clinging to a fragile hope that defied logic. Miraculously, the foal began to recover. The bleeding stopped, and its breathing grew steadier. Each small victory filled Cale with a quiet, unshakable joy. One morning, when he entered the barn with fresh water, he froze in his tracks. The foal was standing, its legs wobbly but holding firm, its eyes bright with newfound strength. "You did it," Kyle whispered, a smile spreading across his face, his voice choked with emotion. "You made it." From that day forward, the foal was no longer just a survivor. It was a companion. Kyle named it Nova, a nod to the spark of life that had refused to extinguish. Wherever Kale went, Nova followed. Its steady gait, a constant reminder of the bond they had forged. The once lonely days on the plains were now filled with warmth and laughter. The foal's playful energy, a perfect match for Kale's unbreakable spirit. Together, they faced the world, their connection as boundless as the horizon before them. As the days stretched on across the wide expanse of the American Midwest, Kyle and his horse Nova grew inseparable. The hours they spent together in the open fields, with the wind whispering through the tall prairie grass and storm clouds swirling on the distant horizon, strengthened a bond that no one in their small Kansas town truly understood. "That horse is something special," some would murmur. But to Kale, Nova was more than just a horse. He was a steadfast companion, the one who had been by his side when no one believed he'd make it through his toughest days. Yet soon enough, strange things began to happen. One evening, as Kyle guided his flock of sheep toward the creek, the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The scene was serene, ordinary, like any other day. The sheep bleated softly, and Nova trotted beside him, ever watchful. Kyle felt at ease, certain the day was drawing to a quiet close. Then, without warning, a dense fog began to form in the distance. It was unusual. Fog was rare in this part of the country, especially at this time of year. Kyle squinted toward the horizon, a furrow forming on his brow. Something felt off. The fog moved quickly, engulfing everything in its path. Within minutes, the familiar landscape disappeared. The mountains far to the west, and the path leading back to town, were swallowed in an eerie gray. An unnatural silence settled over the plains. The sheep, disoriented, began to scatter, their plaintive cries cutting through the stillness. Yet Nova stood firm. The horse remained still, his ears pricked forward as if listening to something Kale couldn't hear. Suddenly, Nova let out a loud, piercing neigh that broke the suffocating quiet of the fog. Without hesitation, he bolted, galloping away from the sheep and heading straight for town. Kyle froze, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. "Where are you going?" he murmured, but a strange feeling settled in his chest. It was the way Nova had reacted, like he knew something Kale didn't. Abandoning his search for the sheep, Kale followed, though he couldn't see more than a foot in front of him. The sound of Nova's hooves pounding against the dry earth became his guide, each strike a lifeline as he moved deeper into the unknown. The fog grew thicker, but then faintly, Kale heard something new. Voices, the shouts of men. "Here he is, over here!" someone called. Relief washed over Kale as the glow of lanterns pierced the murky air. The townsfolk had found him, thanks to Nova. The horse had charged into town, his frantic whinnies unlike anything anyone had heard before. His behavior had been so unusual, so urgent, that the men realized something was wrong and set out to search for Kyle. They arrived just in time. Back in town, the men marveled at Nova's instincts. "That horse isn't like the others," one neighbor remarked. "He's got a sixth sense or something." Kyle, still dazed but grateful, gently patted Nova's flank once they were safely home. "Thank you, my friend," he whispered. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Nova had saved him. And that wasn't the last time the horse's uncanny intuition would reveal itself. A few weeks later, early one morning, Kyle was preparing to head out to the fields when the sky darkened without warning. Thick, black clouds rolled in fast, but the air remained unsettlingly quiet. There was no distant thunder to signal an approaching storm. Nova, calm moments before, began to act strangely. He whinnied loudly and circled Kyle, his movements urgent and frantic as though trying to warn him. "What's wrong with you?" Kyle asked, his voice tinged with worry. Nova didn't stop. He ran in tighter, more erratic circles, his agitation growing. Kyle looked up, just as a sharp, icy gust of wind tore through the air, kicking up dust and leaves in its wake. The chill carried a foreboding weight. Kyle's chest tightened as the realization struck him. A storm was coming, a fierce one, and fast. Thanks to Nova's sharp intuition, Kyle made the swift decision to guide the sheep to the safety of the barn before the storm could unleash its fury upon them in the open field. He barely succeeded. Moments later, the skies split apart, releasing a torrential downpour accompanied by thunder and lightning that seemed to shake the very earth. If not for Nova, both Kyle and the sheep would have been caught under the storm's merciless wrath. Word of Nova's uncanny ability to sense danger spread quickly among the locals. Some spoke of it with admiration, others with a touch of skepticism, but no one denied there was something extraordinary about the horse. It wasn't just his strength or loyalty. There was an indescribable quality, something beyond explanation. More than once, Kyle noticed Nova approaching injured or sick animals with a peculiar tenderness. It was as if the horse could detect pain and suffering. Whenever he did, Nova would nuzzle the wounds gently, and remarkably, the animals would recover faster than any veterinarian could have expected. Though whispers of what it all meant circulated through the village, Kyle would simply smile. To him, Nova was more than just a horse. He was a companion, a trusted friend. Nothing else mattered. Years slipped by on the plains, with their scorching summer days and crisp, silent nights stretching endlessly to the horizon. Nova remained Kyle's steadfast shadow, ever by his side through every journey, as if destiny had bound them together. Kyle, no longer the boy who once rescued a frail colt, had grown into a young man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by the sun. Yet his heart remained unchanged, generous, deeply connected to the land, and loyal to those he loved. It was on one of those golden summer evenings that Kyle met Ilara. She was the daughter of a family that had recently moved into town. Her long, dark, wavy hair shimmered in the sunlight in a way that left Kyle awestruck. Her laughter, light and carefree, echoed over the hills during her walks. It wasn't long before their paths crossed more frequently, especially at the local market. Each encounter stirred something deep within Kyle. One afternoon, as Kyle strolled along the river with Nova, he saw Ilara sitting at the water's edge, her bare feet playfully splashing in the cool stream. He hesitated, uncertain whether to approach. But Nova, as though sensing the longing in Kyle's heart, trotted straight to her, nudging her gently with his nose. Ilara laughed, glancing up with sparkling eyes. "He's so friendly," she said, running her hand along Nova's sleek coat. Kyle, nervous but smiling, scratched the back of his neck. "He's always been like that. Seems he trusts you." That simple meeting marked the start of something neither of them had expected. Nova became the bridge between them. After that day, Ilara and Kyle began to spend more time together. She often joined him on walks across the plains, sometimes riding Nova as the wind played with her hair, while Kyle walked beside them, unable to take his eyes off her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Their love grew steadily, quietly, like the gentle flow of the river winding through the mountains. There were no grand declarations or rushed decisions, only the certainty that their lives were meant to intertwine. It wasn't long before they decided to marry. Their wedding was a modest affair, held in the town's small church. There were no extravagant feasts or luxurious decorations, but what mattered most was their love, and the promise of a life shared together. The townspeople marveled at how happy the couple seemed, and Nova, ever the silent witness, stood at a respectful distance, a symbolic presence at their union. Life with Ilara brought Kyle a profound sense of peace. They worked side by side in the fields, shared laughter, and with each passing day their bond grew stronger. When Ilara finally told Kyle she was expecting their child, he felt as if his already blessed life had reached its pinnacle. "A son," Kyle murmured with a broad smile, his hand resting gently on Ilara's growing belly. "We'll call him Oren." Ilara laughed, her joy lighting up the moment as she shared her excitement with him. Even Nova, the horse, seemed to sense the energy in the air. Though usually calm, the horse occasionally approached Ilara, as if understanding that something profound was happening within her. Her pregnancy progressed without any issues, a smooth and hopeful journey. Kyle spent his days in his workshop, carefully crafting a small cradle for their baby, envisioning the family life they were about to begin. Nova remained a constant presence, sometimes accompanying Kyle to the fields, other times staying close to Ilara, almost as if guarding her. Everything seemed idyllic. The peaceful life on the ranch, the long-anticipated child on the way, the warm afternoons stretching over the plains. But destiny, ever unpredictable, began to weave its threads of uncertainty. What followed was so swift, so cruel, it felt like a terrible dream, one you wish to forget, but that clings to your heart with relentless weight. That morning, Ilara, her belly now round and heavy with life, had left early for town to pick up a few supplies. Kyle stayed back at the ranch, working on the cradle for their baby, a task that filled his heart with quiet satisfaction. Though the days had passed like a gentle breeze, a small knot of anxiety had always lingered within him, the kind of fear that love inevitably brings. But that day was different. Nova, usually serene, began acting strangely. He neighed loudly, pacing restlessly, his hooves striking the dry ground with urgency, as if sensing something Kale could not. Kale set down his hammer and approached the corral, eyeing the agitated horse. "What's wrong, Nova?" he murmured, running a hand over the horse's back. But the animal only grew more restless, its eyes fixed on the horizon, seeing something Kyle couldn't. And then the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the stillness of the afternoon. Kyle's heart sank before he even picked up the receiver, a dark premonition that chilled him to the core. "Mr. Kale?" The voice on the other end was formal but carried a heavy, almost compassionate tone. "This is the hospital. I'm so sorry, but your wife, Ilara, has been in an accident. She gave birth, but—" The words hung in the air, unfinished and suffocating. Kyle felt a wave of cold sweep through him, his body rigid with dread. "Ilara, where is she?" His voice was barely audible, weak and trembling. "I'm sorry, sir, she didn't make it. Your son is in intensive care. You need to come to the hospital immediately." The call ended, but the words lingered, echoing in his mind. She didn't make it. His Ilara, the woman who brought light to every shadowed corner of his life, was gone. The grief hit him like a storm, leaving him staggering. His legs felt weak, his chest crushed under an invisible weight. "Ilara!" he cried out, but the only reply was the wind and Nova's distant, unsettled whinny. Dazed and desperate, Kyle moved on instinct, rushing to his car. He had to reach Oren, the tiny spark of life that remained. His mind was a whirlwind of anguish, his vision blurred by the tears that refused to fall. His trembling hands gripped the steering wheel, and he pressed the accelerator without thought, driven by desperation. The road to the hospital stretched endlessly before him, winding and perilous. Memories of Ilara flooded his mind, her laughter, her sparkling eyes, the dreams they had nurtured together. They played out like a fragmented film, pieces of a story now cruelly unfinished. But before he could fully grasp the enormity of his pain, fate struck once again. On a sharp curve, the car skidded. The tires lost their grip on the loose gravel, and the vehicle spiraled out of control. Kyle yanked the wheel, but the seconds ticked by mercilessly fast. There was no time to correct his course. Everything he had left to lose seemed to slip away in that moment as the world spun and darkness closed in. The clash of metal against stone was the last thing he heard before everything went black. Somewhere in the distance, Nova let out another piercing neigh, a cry that echoed across the desolate plains. Time seemed to pause in that moment. Kyle lay unconscious, trapped amidst the twisted wreckage of his car, while his newborn son fought for his life in an incubator, deprived of his mother's warmth. Tragedy had enveloped the family like a suffocating shroud, and storm clouds gathered ominously on the horizon. Hours later, paramedics found Kyle. Carefully, they extracted him from the wreck, his breathing shallow, his body mangled by the impact. He was rushed to the hospital, the same hospital where his infant son clung to life. Now, father and son teetered at the edge of oblivion, suspended in a fragile balance between life and death. From a distance, Nova watched, his dark eyes holding a depth of understanding beyond human perception. The bond between the horse and Kale had always been something extraordinary, a connection words could never fully capture. As Kale's life hung by a thread, Nova stood motionless, as though aware that his presence was vital. The hospital was cloaked in an eerie stillness. Cold lights flickered down sterile hallways, punctuated only by the steady beeping of monitors. In one room, Kyle lay on the brink of death, while just a few doors away, in the neonatal intensive care unit, baby Oren fought his own battle for survival. The family's tragedy descended like an unanticipated storm, casting shadows on every corner of the hospital. Doctors moved through the halls with grim faces, burdened by the weight of inevitable loss. Sorin, the doctor overseeing Kyle's case, studied the monitors intently, her expression reflecting years of witnessing fragile bodies battered by fate's merciless hand. She sighed deeply, aware that medicine had its limits and destiny often had its own designs. Her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected sound, a neigh, distant yet distinct. Sorin's eyes widened as she exchanged baffled glances with a nurse. "What was that?" she murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. Moments later, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoed through the corridor. Shouts erupted, nervous voices accompanied by the metallic hiss of an automatic door sliding open. The fluorescent lights flickered, and then a louder, more commanding neigh pierced the air. It was a sound so powerful, so otherworldly, that everyone in the hospital froze in place. "What's going on?" a nurse called out from the end of the hall. Through the commotion, Nova appeared. Majestic and unyielding, the horse commanded the attention of every eye. The disbelief was palpable as people watched, unable to comprehend what was happening. Nova strode forward with a purposeful calm, unfazed by the alarms or chaos that surrounded him. It was as if an unseen force guided him, something larger than life itself. The horse made his way to the room where Kyle lay. The door slid open, and Nova entered with an air of quiet authority. Doctors and nurses stood frozen, stunned into silence. Only Sorin managed to speak, her voice trembling yet firm. "Everyone, stay calm," she urged, though the surreal nature of the moment unsettled her deeply. Something in the horse's deliberate movements stilled her own fears. Nova approached Cale's bedside as if drawn by an unshakable instinct. The machines monitoring Cale's vital signs beeped steadily, their readings bleak and disheartening. The medical staff had all but resigned themselves to the inevitable. But Nova appeared unwilling to accept such a fate. The horse stood close, bowing his head gently toward Cale in an almost reverent gesture. Then he let out a neigh, a deep, resonant sound that filled the room with an inexplicable energy. In that instant, something shifted. The monitors, which had displayed chaotic, weak readings, began to stabilize. Kyle's heartbeat, which had seemed to plummet into an abyss, began to regain its strength, little by little. The doctors stared at the monitors in disbelief as the rhythmic beeping of the machines grew more irregular. Sorin rushed to the display, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to make sense of the sudden change. "This can't be possible," she murmured, her voice barely audible, caught somewhere between astonishment and disbelief. She glanced at Kyle, whose pallor was gradually giving way to a faint flush of color. Slowly, his eyelids quivered, as though he were fighting to open his eyes. But this wasn't the only remarkable event unfolding. Across the hospital, in the intensive care unit, a nurse watched over Oren with an exhausted gaze. The baby, born prematurely and clinging to a fragile existence, had shown no signs of improvement for hours. Suddenly, the baby monitor emitted a different tone. Oren's weak, faltering heartbeat began to stabilize, growing stronger with each passing moment. His tiny lungs expanded more easily, drawing in air with a newfound strength. The nurse moved closer to the glass, separating her from the incubator, her breath catching as she noticed something extraordinary. Oren's tiny fingers twitched. She hurried to alert the doctors, her voice trembling with urgency. "He's responding!" she cried out, the words reverberating down the sterile hallway. What had started in Cale's room now extended to Oren, as if an invisible thread bound the two together. Something, perhaps the unspoken connection between a father and his child, or perhaps a force far greater, was pulling them both back from the edge of the abyss. Beside Cale's bed, Nova, his steadfast horse, lowered its head once more, as if acknowledging its role in the unfolding miracle. No further explanation seemed necessary. The doctors and nurses, though still stunned, couldn't deny what was before their eyes. Kyle, the man who had hovered between life and death just hours earlier, was now breathing steadily. Kyle's eyelids fluttered open, and he felt as though he were emerging from a dense, impenetrable fog. At first, his vision was blurred. The sterile brightness of the hospital room stung his eyes, and the steady hum of the machines left him disoriented. Gradually, however, one image came into focus. Nova. The horse stood by his bedside, a surreal yet comforting presence in the clinical setting. Nova's dark, knowing eyes seemed to carry an ancient wisdom, as if it truly understood the gravity of the moment. A warm sensation filled Cale's chest, a blend of gratitude and awe. He didn't need anyone to explain it to him. He knew. Nova had saved him. It wasn't the first time his loyal companion had come to his rescue, but this was different. The horse had brought him back from the precipice of death itself. Kyle tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his voice barely emerged as a whisper. Nova leaned in gently, almost as if sensing the unspoken words. In that quiet gesture, Kyle felt everything: the unyielding loyalty of a friend, the unbreakable bond forged over years, and something deeper, ineffable, that transcended words. Lingering in his mind was the memory of an infinite whiteness, an ethereal realm somewhere between dreams and death. There had been no pain, but neither had there been life, only an immense void, silent except for the distant echo of hoofbeats. In that liminal space, Kyle had floated, untethered, until Nova's call pierced through the stillness. He remembered the sight of his horse galloping toward him, its neigh a rallying cry that shattered the emptiness. It was that sound, a fierce, undeniable affirmation of life, that had guided him back. As Kyle lay there, absorbing the magnitude of what had transpired, Sorin entered the room. Her expression was a mixture of astonishment and unease. As a doctor, she wasn't unfamiliar with unexpected recoveries, but what had happened with Kyle and Oren defied all medical reasoning. Even more disconcerting was Nova's presence. No animal should have been in the hospital, let alone in a patient's room. Yet there the horse stood, as if it belonged, an intrinsic part of the healing process. "How are you feeling?" Sorin asked softly, her voice careful, as though she feared disrupting the fragile balance of the moment. Kyle attempted to respond, but his words came out hoarse, barely audible. "Alive," he whispered, the word heavy in the air. Sorin nodded, though her mind churned with unanswered questions. She knew there was more to this story, something she couldn't yet grasp. Deep inside, a part of her began to accept that perhaps not everything could be explained by science. Maybe there were forces at work, beyond what doctors could measure or predict. "Oren is improving too," she said after a pause, watching Kyle's reaction carefully. "He's still in the ICU, but he's responding well. It's as if, well, both of them are pulling through the worst." Kyle closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. His son, his little Oren, had survived. Amid the immense sorrow of losing Elara, his son's life shone like a spark in the darkness. He clung to that. "Thank you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was addressing. Sorin, Nova, fate itself. Everything felt so inexplicably intertwined. With a gentle gesture, Sorin left Kale to rest, though her mind remained busy, processing everything that had happened. As she stepped out of the room, she encountered a nurse hurrying from the neonatal unit. "Doctor," the nurse said, her voice still tinged with awe, "the baby's responding better than we ever expected. It's like something shifted overnight. Whatever it is, it's miracle." Sorin simply nodded, though the nurse's words echoed in her thoughts. There was no other way to describe it. Something miraculous was unfolding, defying all she had learned in medical school. Meanwhile, alone in his room, Kyle sank deeper into his thoughts. The pain of losing Elara lingered, sharp and relentless, like a wound that would never fully heal. Yet, Oren's survival gave him a reason to keep going. He couldn't give up, not now. His son needed him, and for Oren, he would find the strength to carry on. Nova, steadfast at his side, remained silent, as if he understood the weight of the burden Kyle now bore. The horse hadn't left him for a moment, and in those deep, knowing eyes, Kyle found the solace he so desperately needed. Time at the hospital crawled forward, but with each passing day, both Kyle and little Oren grew stronger. The journey to recovery wasn't easy. Days stretched long, and the nights were haunted by memories of Elara, memories that seeped into Kyle's dreams, filling them with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and longing. Yet, what kept him grounded, what pushed him to rise each morning, was the innocent gaze of his son. Though fragile at first, Oren's will to live was a force that fueled Cale's resolve. Outside the hospital, Nova kept his quiet vigil. From a small area Sorin had arranged for him, the horse kept watch on the window of the room where Cale and Oren were. Nova, enigmatic as ever, stayed close, seeming to sense his role wasn't yet complete. His presence was calm and unobtrusive, almost invisible to those unfamiliar with him. Sorin, mindful of the unique bond between the horse and her patient, ensured Nova was cared for, providing fresh water and feed each day. Initially, the nurses were puzzled by the unusual arrangement, but they quickly adapted to the routine of tending to Nova. "That horse seems more human than some people I know," one nurse quipped, pouring water into a bucket under Nova's watchful gaze. As Cale grew stronger, he too became increasingly aware of Nova's constant presence just beyond the window. Silently, he thanked the horse for never leaving his side. Not during the crash, not through the darkest days, and not now as he worked to rebuild his life. From the moment of the accident, when all seemed lost, to these fragile but hopeful steps toward recovery, Nova had been his guardian, his compass, his quiet protector. There was something about that bond that defied reason, a connection so profound it needed no explanation. Deep within his soul, Kyle knew that Nova was far more than just a horse. Over time, Oren's health began to improve dramatically. The little boy started to smile again, responding to his father's gentle touch. Then came the news Cale had been longing for. "You'll be able to go home soon." The words echoed in Kyle's mind like a balm for his wounded spirit. Returning home meant facing the emptiness Elara had left behind, but it also offered a chance for a fresh start, a life with his son, built on love and hope. The day of their discharge finally arrived. As Kyle prepared to leave the hospital with Oren cradled in his arms, he glanced out the window, searching for Nova. The horse was there, as always, but something about him had changed. There was no urgency, no restless pacing, only a serene stillness. It was as if Nova knew his purpose had been fulfilled. "Thank you, my friend," Kyle whispered, even though the glass between them would muffle his words. But Nova, as though he understood, let out a soft, gentle neigh. For the first time in days, Cale felt a sense of calm. As he left the hospital, Oren nestled securely against his chest. Cale said goodbye to Sorin, the doctor who had guided him through one of the darkest times in his life. "Take care, Cale," she said with a warm smile, "and take care of that boy. He's got your strength." Cale nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. Before he stepped away, he cast one last look at Nova. "We'll meet again someday," he thought, though a part of him understood this goodbye was final. Quietly, Nova began walking toward the plains, his gait steady and unhurried as he disappeared into the horizon. Kyle stood there watching until the horse's silhouette faded into the landscape. He didn't know how long he remained there, unmoving, but when he finally turned away, something within him had shifted. Nova was no longer physically with them, yet his presence, his spirit, would remain, guiding Cale and Oren in the days to come. Back at the ranch, life found a new rhythm. Kyle learned to manage the sprawling property without Elara, always with Oren close by, either in his arms or toddling at his side. Though the loss was profound, the boy became a daily reminder that love never truly leaves. In Oren's smallest gestures, his radiant smile, and even his quiet movements, Kyle could feel Elara's love lingering. Sometimes Kale would pause by the edge of the plains, gazing toward the horizon where he had last seen Nova. Memories would come easily, finding the injured foal, hours spent nursing him back to health, and all the times Nova had inexplicably been there when Kyle needed him most. Life was a strange, mysterious cycle, Kyle reflected. He had saved Nova first, and then, when it mattered most, Nova had saved him and his son in return. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fully understood, he would murmur to himself, watching the sun sink below the horizon. But one truth anchored him. Love, loyalty, and friendship could transcend even the most insurmountable boundaries, including death. As the days turned into weeks, Kyle found solace in these thoughts. He knew he could never forget Ilara, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Oren needed him, and the memory of Nova would forever light his way. One afternoon, as Kale watched Oren take his first wobbly steps, a rare peace washed over him. Life moved forward, he realized. The pain didn't disappear completely, but love had an incredible way of filling the voids it left behind. At that moment, with the wind softly brushing through the fields, Kyle looked toward the horizon and smiled. He understood now. Though Nova had returned to the plains, his essence remained, woven into every corner of their lives. It was a reminder that true bonds, those forged in love and devotion, could never be completely broken. The story we just explored reveals a profound connection between humans and animals, highlighting the extraordinary bond between Kale and Nova. Throughout the narrative, Nova is more than just a horse. He becomes Kale's steadfast companion, his guide and protector during the darkest chapters of his life. Their relationship transcends the ordinary, reaching an almost spiritual level where the animal seems to intuitively understand Kale's pain, needs, and fears in ways that go beyond words. Kyle's emotional journey is one of loss, love, and redemption. The death of his wife, Ilara, plunges him into a chasm of grief, but it is the presence of Nova, and later his son Oren, that keeps him grounded. Nova represents not only the unwavering loyalty and unconditional love that animals are capable of, but also serves as a beacon of hope amid despair. Through his bond with Nova, Kale rediscovers the strength to persevere, to not give up when faced with life's trials. The message of this story is clear. When animals are treated with love and respect, they can return that affection in ways that are both profound and unexpected. The connection between Kyle and Nova reminds us that the bonds we share with animals can be as powerful as those we share with people. This connection can bring comfort, heal invisible wounds, and remind us that in our darkest moments, love and loyalty, no matter where they come from, will always guide us toward the light. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and guide you in every step of your journey.